As Jackson took the same view, the enterprise was committed to him, and a carefully drawn order was prepared, Num 1-91, detailing the march of each division. Jackson, with his corps, except D.H. Hill's division, was ordered via Williamsport to drive the Federals from Martinsburg into Harper's Ferry, which he would then attack from the south. Walker's division was to cross the Potomac below Harper's Ferry and occupy Loudon Heights. McLaws, with his own and Anderson's divisions, was to move by the most direct route and possess himself of Maryland Heights, overlooking Harper's Ferry, whence he could, with artillery and even with musketry, command the town. Longstreet, with the two divisions of D.R. Jones and Evans, was to march to Boonesboro and await the return of the forces from Harper's Ferry. Finally, D.H. Hill's division was to act as rearguard at Turner's Gap in South Mountain. On September 10, the army marched at daylight. On the road, Longstreet was ordered to continue his movement to Hagerstown, while D.H. Hill, leaving 2 brigades in Turner's Gap, came on to Boonesboro. This change was caused by the collection of a force of Pennsylvania militia at Chambersburg. It was not formidable, as the regiments refused to leave the state, yet its formation materially affected the course of events. For it will be seen that this separation of Longstreet by 13 miles from D.H. Hill caused the loss of the position at Turner's Gap. The loss of that gap brought on at Sharpsburg the battle which would otherwise have probably been fought upon the mountain. Meanwhile, there had occurred the mishap already referred to, which gave to McClellan an opportunity rarely presented to a general. An official copy of Lee's Order No. 191, addressed to D.H. Hill, fell into McClellan's hands on September 13, soon after his arrival at Frederick. The incident occurred from our unsettled organization. D.H. Hill's division had been attached to Jackson's command upon its crossing the Potomac. No order should have issued from Lee's office for Hill. Jackson so understood it, and, with his usual cautious habit, on receipt of the order, with his own hand made a copy for Hill and sent it. This copy Hill received and carefully preserved, and produced it after the war, when the matter was first inquired into. But Lee's office had also prepared an official copy for Hill, and this copy, serving as a wrapper to 3 cigars, was picked up by a private soldier of the 12th Corps in an abandoned camp near Frederick. When found, it was promptly carried to McClellan, reaching him before noon on the 13th. Its importance was recognized, and its authenticity proved by the fact that the different Confederate divisions had all pursued the roads assigned them in the order. Already McClellan had learned of the crossing of the Potomac by Walker at Point of Rocks and by Jackson at Williamsport, but he had not understood the object. There had been fear that it might mean a dash at the lines about Alexandria. Now the whole situation was explained. Lee and Longstreet, with only 14 brigades, were about Boonesboro. McLaws and Anderson, with 10 brigades, were between Harper's Ferry and Crampton's Gap, 8 miles south of Turner's Gap. Jackson, with 14 brigades, was southwest of Harper's Ferry, and Walker, with 2 brigades, was southeast of it, across the Shenandoah. By all the maxims of strategy, Lee had put it in the power of McClellan to destroy his army. He had not only divided his force into 4 parts and scattered them, with rivers and mountains between, but he had scattered more than was necessary. There was no need to place Longstreet as far away even as Boonesboro. A safer movement would have been to unite Longstreet with McLaws and Anderson at Crampton's Gap, that it might be more securely held, and the capture of Maryland Heights be expedited, and that the distances separating his forces should be the least possible. McClellan's opportunity was obvious. It was to take quick advantage of the separation and move in between the parts, then to overwhelm each in detail. This could be done by forcing the bulk of his army through Crampton's Gap. This move would have the further advantage of most speedily relieving Harper's Ferry, but just as Pope had lost his campaign by moving directly upon Jackson, as he supposed, at Manassas Junction instead of upon Gainesville, where he would have been between Jackson and Lee, here McClellan lost his campaign by moving directly after Lee upon Turner's Gap. Even that he did with deliberation strangely out of place for the occasion. By night, marches, over good roads with a good moon, he might have attacked and carried both Turner's and Crampton's gaps by sunrise on the 14th, for each was then held by only cavalry and a single brigade of infantry. Fortunately for Lee, a citizen of Frederick whose sympathies were with the Confederate cause, was accidentally present at McClellan's headquarters during the afternoon of the 13th, and heard expressions of gratification at the finding of the order, and learned of directions being given for a vigorous advance the next morning. With full appreciation of its importance, he made his way through the Federal lines and brought the information after dark to Stuart, who at once sent it on to Lee, then in camp at Hagerstown. 4 brigades of Hill's division were at different points, from 2 to 5 miles west of Turner's Pass. They were ordered back and barely arrived in time to save it from being seized by the enemy. Meanwhile, too, Jones's and Evans's divisions were ordered to march in the morning to reinforce Hill, and Lee and Longstreet returned with them to Turner's Gap. It was between 3 and 4 o'clock when they reached the scene of action, after an oppressively hot and dusty march of 14 miles. There were 8 brigades in the column, Toombs being left at Hagerstown to protect the trains. Hill had already had severe fighting. Turner's Pass was flanked upon each side by secondary passes within a mile, through each of which roads reached the crest, and crossroads connected both with the main pike. On the right, Garland's brigade had been attacked at 7 a.m. by a superior force. General Garland, an officer of great promise, had been killed, and his brigade driven back in confusion. But the enemy did not follow up, and Anderson's brigade arrived in time to hold the position. D.H. Hill never failed to get good fighting out of his veteran division, and from 7 a.m. to 3 p.m., without support, he held the gap successfully. But 2 corps of the enemy, the 1st and 9th, comprising 18 brigades and 18 batteries, were attacking it and gradually outflanking Hill's positions. By 3 p.m., they had occupied ground on the Confederate left, which assured their final success in spite of all that could be accomplished by the 8 tired brigades newly arrived. These, however, began to climb the hills from the west in support of Hill's 5 brigades, now much reduced by their long conflict. Hill, in his report, says, "Had Longstreet's division been with mine at daylight in the morning, the Yankees would have been disastrously repulsed, but they had gained important positions before the arrival of reinforcements. These came up after a long, hurried and exhausting march to defend localities of which they were ignorant, and to fight a foe flushed with partial success and already holding key points to farther advance. Had our forces never been separated, the Battle of Sharpsburg never would have been fought." On the arrival of the head of Longstreet's column, Evans was sent to the left to support Rhodes, and Kemper, Jenkins, and Pickett's were sent to the right at the foot of the mountain, by a rough road, to meet a force of the enemy said to be crossing the mountain in that direction. After marching 1.5 miles, the report having been found to be erroneous, they were called to hasten to the top of the mountain by obscure byroads and across fields, and on reaching the top they were at once sharply engaged. Longstreet writes, "They were put in as they arrived to try to cover the right of Rhodes and Evans and fill the intervening space to the turnpike. As they marched, the men dropped along the road as rapidly as if under severe skirmish. So manifest was it that nature was exhausted that no one urged them to get up and try to keep their ranks. Before their ranks could be formed, they were under fire, and the action was kept up until darkness finally called its truce upon the field. At this time both Lee and Jackson were disabled and compelled to ride in ambulances. On August 31, Lee, in reconnoitring Pope's lines, had dismounted and was holding his horse by the bridle when an alarm of Federal cavalry had startled the party, and the general's horse had jerked him to the ground, fracturing some of the bones of his right hand. It now was carried in a sling, and he could not handle his reins. Jackson at Frederick had been presented with a fine horse, but the animal was not well broken and had reared up and fallen over, bruising him so that he too was an invalid. Lee was now halted at the foot of the mountain, and thither Longstreet and Hill repaired as the firing ceased. Hill made a report of the situation. Darkness had saved the Confederate line from serious disaster. The tired troops and trains could not be allowed to rest, but must at once be put in motion to the rear. At first, Lee designated Keedysville as the point at which the troops would halt, but later news reached him that the enemy had also gotten possession of Crampton's Gap, and he changed the order and directed that the new position should be at Sharpsburg, behind the Antietam River, distant from Turner's Gap about 10 miles. D. H. Hill's troops were first withdrawn and were followed by the rest of the infantry and artillery. Fitz-Lee's brigade of cavalry and Hood's and Whiting's brigades of infantry acted as rear guard to the column. My reserve ordnance train of about 80 wagons had accompanied Lee's headquarters to Hagerstown and had also followed the march back to Boonesborough. I was now ordered to cross the Potomac at Williamsport and go thence to Shepherdstown, where I should leave the train and come in person to Sharpsburg. The moon was rising as I started, and about daylight I forded the Potomac, unaware of having had a narrow escape from capture with my train by Gregg's brigade of cavalry. This brigade had escaped that night from Harper's Ferry and crossed our line of retreat from Boonesborough. It had captured and destroyed the reserve ordnance train of 45 wagons of Longstreet's corps. It is now necessary to describe what took place at Crampton's Gap, where McClellan should have gone in person, as that position was the key point of the whole situation. Only Franklin's corps of 9 brigades was sent there. They might have marched on the 13th from their position, 3 miles east of Jefferson, but did not until the 14th. Having only about 10 miles to go, they arrived in the forenoon, and at once deployed and formed for attack. The Gap offered fairly good positions for defence of its eastern outlet, had there been troops enough to hold its flanks, but the task imposed upon McLaws, with his 4 brigades and Anderson's 6, was beyond his strength. To protect his own rear, and to prevent the escape from Harper's Ferry of the 13,000 men to be besieged there, while he captured the heights above them and cannonaded them into a surrender, it was essential that he should occupy Pleasant Valley. This lay between the Blue Ridge, here called South Mountain, on the east, and Elk Ridge, or Maryland Heights, on the west. The protection of his rear required him to hold in force Crampton's Gap in the Blue Ridge, and to observe Brownsville Gap, about a mile south of it, and also Solomon's Gap in Elk Ridge opposite on the west. At Weverton, where the Potomac breaks through the Blue Ridge, 5 miles from Crampton's, he had to protect against an advance from the direction of Washington, and at Sandy Hook, where the road from Harper's Ferry comes around South Mountain into Pleasant Valley, he had to guard against an attack by the whole garrison of Harper's Ferry. Besides this, he had to send a force along Elk Ridge strong enough to defeat the entrenched brigade which held the extremity, overlooking Harper's Ferry, and to hold it while his guns bombarded the town. There was thus 1 point to be attacked, 2 others to be observed, and 3 to be defended against large forces. The 2 most important points, Crampton's Gap and Sandy Hook, were over 5 miles apart. Considering the proximity of the immense Federal force, McLaws and Anderson were within the lion's mouth, and that they ever got out of it was no less due to good management than it was to good luck on their part, and mismanagement by the enemy. Holding Crampton's Gap were only Munford's cavalry and Mahone's brigade of infantry under Parham. Cobb's brigade and part of Semmes's were near in reserve. From noon on the 14th until near 5 o'clock, there was sharp skirmishing and artillery fire, while the enemy deployed Slocum's division on his right and Smith's on his left. Having by then gotten the measure of their enemy, and deployed lines which outflanked him upon both sides, a handsome charge was made by 4 brigades, Bartlett's, Newton's, Torbert's, and Brooks. Of course there could be no effective resistance. The whole Confederate line was overwhelmed and driven back in confusion. The reserve endeavoured to rally the fugitives, but the small force, only about 2,200 men in all, were so far outflanked by the Federal lines that no stand could be held until darkness put an end to the Federal pursuit, the whole Gap being now in their possession. The battle was well contested, as shown by the losses inflicted upon the enemy, 531 killed and wounded. The Confederates were fortunate to get off with a loss, as reported by Franklin, of only 400 prisoners, and 450 killed and wounded left upon the field, and a single gun. In the scattered condition of McLaws's command, he was now in great danger. His one chance of safety was in an early surrender of Harper's Ferry to afford him an outlet for escape. He acted promptly and with good judgment. Drawing the brigades of Kershaw, Wilcox, and Barksdale from the forces on South Mountain, with the remnants of Semmes, Cobb, and Mahone, he threw a line of battle across Pleasant Valley about 1.5 miles below Crampton's Gap, with its left flank upon Elk Ridge and its right upon South Mountain. Here he made a bold front on the morning of the 15th against Franklin and his whole corps. Of course, Franklin, about 12,000 strong, could have run over him, and was under orders too to do so. Franklin was preparing to undertake the work when, about 8 o'clock, heavy firing, which had been going on for over 2 hours at Harper's Ferry, suddenly ceased. Franklin correctly interpreted this to mean that Miles, at Harper's Ferry, had surrendered, and he abandoned his proposed attack. This was a gross blunder. It lost an easy opportunity to defeat 6 of Lee's brigades. One can but wonder if McClellan had communicated to Franklin a copy of Lee's order No. 191, for with the knowledge of the situation given by that order, it seems impossible that the latter could have remained idle so near a divided enemy for 2 whole days, as he now did on the 15th and 16th, receiving meanwhile no orders from McClellan. McClellan either did not himself appreciate the value of the opportunity chance had given him, or did not choose to let Halleck know it. His letters to them seem vague and non-committal. He cannot be held blameless for Franklin's small performance in view of the opportunity. Let us now turn to Harper's Ferry. Jackson, with his 3 divisions under Jones, Lawton, and A.P. Hill, marching from Frederick on September 10, had much the longest march to make, about 62 miles, nearly double those of McLaws and Walker. He made it, however, in good time, his marches being on the 10th, 14 miles, on the 11th, 20 miles, on the 12th, 16 miles, and on the 13th, by 11 a.m., 12 miles, which brought him to the Harper's Ferry pickets. The other commands reached their destinations about the same time, and the next morning signal parties opened wigwag communication between all. McLaws had had some fighting to get in position on South Mountain, for it had been held by a brigade and 2 batteries under Coland Ford. Ford did not make a good defence, and was afterward court-martialed and dismissed. During the forenoon of the 14th, Walker, on Loudon Heights, reported 6 rifled guns in position, but Jackson ordered him not to open fire until McLaws was ready. Jackson, before opening fire, intended to demand a surrender and to allow time for non-combatants to be removed. Before this could be done, however, the sounds of battle at Turner's and Crampton's Gaps admonished him of the importance of hours, and, about 4 p.m., McLaws being prepared, a heavy cannonade was opened and kept up during the rest of the afternoon. Its effect, however, was more moral than physical. The rifled ammunition of the Confederates was decidedly inferior to that of the enemy, many of their shells failing to burst, or bursting prematurely, or tumbling, and even the smooth-bore shells often burst near the guns. The part of the town near the rivers was within effective range of McLaws and Walker, but Bolivar Heights, where the most of the Federal force was located, was beyond it. Meanwhile, Jackson arranged a direct assault upon Bolivar Heights. 10 of Walker's rifles were brought across the Shenandoah, about 4 miles above the town, and found good positions to take in rear the Federal lines from spurs near the river. A.P. Hill's infantry, on Jackson's right, worked down the river bank over ground the Federals had thought impassable, and found lodgment in rear of the Federal line, and Hill's artillery established several batteries on the very ridge held by the Federals, and in easy range. On the left, near the Potomac, Jones's division drove off Federal outposts, and also established batteries in effective range on commanding hills. Opposite the centre, Ewell's division under Lawton was moved up near the works, and its smooth-bores posted for direct fire. All was ready by the morning of the 15th, and Jackson had the game in his hands. The Federals, indeed, were naturally depressed. Their affair on Maryland Heights with McLaws had been discouraging, and now they saw guns being posted to command all of their positions. Colar Davis, with about 1,200 cavalry, got permission to make his escape during the night. The road to Sharpsburg, on the north bank of the river, was unguarded, save by a picket some 4 miles out. The cavalry crossed on the pontoon bridge and made its escape, riding by the picket at a gallop in the moonlight. On their march to Hagerstown, they had the luck to meet Longstreet's reserve ordnance train, as already told, and burned 45 wagons of ammunition. This train had a guard, but unfortunately it was concentrated at the rear, where alone was danger apprehended. Before sunrise on the 15th, Jackson opened all his guns from 7 points and prepared to storm the Federal lines after a severe cannonade. His new positions gave effective enfilade fire at fair ranges. Lilton Binney, of Miles's staff, writes in his journal, "We are surrounded by enemy's batteries. They open from Loudon Mountain and Loudon Farm, Maryland Heights, Charlestown Road, Shepherdstown Road. Nothing could stand before such a raking cannonade. Miles was everywhere, exposing himself to danger with the bravest, encouraging his artillerists, and met with many narrow escapes from the bursting shells of the enemy." At 8 a.m., our battery officers report their ammunition exhausted. General White meets Coulter Miles on the crest of heights and consults. The white flag is exhibited, the artillery stops firing for about 15 minutes, when the enemy again open with a terrific cannonade. Colgan Miles and Lieutenant Binney, aide-de-camp, started down the eastern slope of the heights, where every inch of ground is being torn up by the enemy's fire. Colton Miles took Lieutenant Binney's hand and remarked, "Well, Mr. Binney, we have done our duty, but where can McClellan be? The rebels have opened on us again. What do they mean?" Immediately after a shell passed us, striking and exploding immediately behind us, a piece of which tore the flesh entirely from his left calf, and a small piece cutting his right calf slightly. Lieutenant Binney immediately tied his handkerchief above the knee and called for assistance, put him in a blanket, and obtaining 6 men, dragged him to an ambulance and sent word to General White. Colton Miles only survived for a day. A military commission which reported upon the circumstances of the surrender severely criticised it as premature. It may be said, however, that the immediate necessity for surrender was not to escape the fire of the artillery, which was so much in evidence, but the charge of the infantry which was about to follow. The actual casualties of the Federals were 217. The total number surrendered was about 12,500. Jackson, in his official report, says, "In an hour the enemy's fire seemed to be silenced, and the batteries of Jenon Hill were ordered to cease their fire, which was the signal for storming the works. General Pender had commenced his advance, when the enemy again opening, Pegram and Crenshaw moved forward their batteries and poured a rapid fire into the enemy. The white flag was now displayed, and shortly afterward General White, the commanding officer, Colonel D.S. Miles, having been mortally wounded, with a garrison of about 11,000 men, surrendered as prisoners of war. Under this capitulation we took possession of 73 pieces of artillery, some 13,000 small arms, and other stores. Liberal terms were granted to General White and the officers under his command in the surrender, which, I regret to say, do not seem from subsequent events to have been properly appreciated by their government. It is interesting to inquire why this criticism. The official reports contain 2 documents which may explain. The first is a letter from General White to General D. Tyler at Annapolis, as follows. General, I have the honour to state that, after capitulating at Harper's Ferry, I was allowed by General A. P. Hill, commanding at that post the forces of the enemy, some 24 wagons for the transportation of officers' baggage after my pledge to return them to the enemy's lines. I respectfully request, therefore, that the quartermaster be directed to forward them back. Tyler, however, instead of returning them, forwarded White's letter to Halleck's office, calling it a strange arrangement, and asks, shall the wagons be returned, and how? What Tyler saw strange in it is not clear, but the tone of the letter suggests that difficulty was made, which is confirmed by Hill's report that the wagons which were loaned to carry off the private baggage of the officers were not returned for nearly 2 months, and not until repeated calls had been made for them. The second document, by Lieutenant Bacon, adjutant of Dutassi's brigade, concerns the paroling of the Federals. A difference arose between Colonel Dutassi and Jenner Branch, in charge of the details, as to the meaning of the words "will not serve against the Confederate States until regularly exchanged." A pass to the brigade, allowing it to cross the bridge, was refused until the matter was adjusted. Dutassi claimed that they might go west and serve against the Indians. The question was referred to General A.P. Hill, who refused to admit that understanding. This was about 9 p.m. About 6 a.m. Lieutenant Bacon reports that he handed the muster rolls to General Hill at his headquarters and asked a pass for the brigade. Hill asked if the brigade was paroled. I replied, evasively, "I thought so." He then sat down and wrote a pass, upon which we immediately crossed the river, thus giving them the slip. Upon the announcement of the surrender, Colonel Dutassi ordered the colours of all the regiments of our brigade to be conveyed to his headquarters. This was done, and 2 hours were spent in removing the various colours from their staffs and packing them in the colonel's private trunk. The Adjutant General of General Gregg made several demands on me for the colours, where I was engaged on the hill turning over the arms. I informed him that they had been sent to our brigade headquarters. He left, but shortly returned, saying that he could not find them. I said I regretted it, but could not aid him, that he must see my colonel. These flags are now in my colonel's private trunks in this city. These are the simple facts which, on my honour as a gentleman, I certify to. A military commission which investigated found nothing that called for censure in these matters, and per contra had a complaint of its own, as follows. During the week previous to the evacuation of Maryland Heights, a Lieutenant Rouse of the 12th Vair Cav, who had been engaged in a raid upon a train from Harper's Ferry to Winchester a short time before, was captured and brought into Harper's Ferry. He escaped while on the way to the hospital, pretending to be sick, but was retaken. He was paroled, but returned in command of some rebel cavalry on the morning of the surrender. The attention of General A.P. Hill was called to the fact that Lieutenant Rouse was a paroled prisoner, but no attention was paid to it. Lieutenant Rouse, on being spoken to about it, laughed at the idea of observing his parole. The casualties given in Mahone's brigade include those of the Battle of Sharpsburg, which was not reported separately. No reports were made by the Confederate cavalry. The Confederate casualties at Boonesboro are not reported separately, except Rhodes's brigade, which reports killed 61, wounded 151, missing 204, total 522. It was most severely engaged of any, except possibly Garland's, which was routed when he was killed. Garland's losses for the whole campaign are given as killed 86, wounded 440, total 526. Chapter 13. Sharpsburg or Antietam. The surrender of Harper's Ferry had come in the very nick of time for the Confederates. Fortunately for them, Franklin at Crampton's Gap, as already told, interpreted the cessation of firing as an indication that there was now no use in his attacking the enemy in his front, for orders were on the way from Lee summoning McLaws to withdraw immediately from your position on Maryland Heights and join us here. If you cannot get off any other way, you must cross the mountain. The utmost dispatch is required. Jackson, too, had been urgently summoned. As soon as the terms of capitulation were agreed upon, he ordered Hill to superintend the paroling of the Federals, cooked 2 days' rations, and set out with his own and Walker's divisions at 1 a.m. for Sharpsburg, distant 17 miles. By a rapid night march he arrived early on the 16th, having forded the Potomac at daylight, at Boteler's Ford near Shepherdstown. McLaws extricated himself from Pleasant Valley by coming into Harper's Ferry. Here he was, much delayed in crossing the pontoon bridge with his trains and getting through the crowded streets. It was after dark on the 16th when his tired and hungry troops bivouacked within 2 miles of Shepherdstown. At midnight, summoned by Lee, he marched again, and, crossing the ford before daylight, the head of his column reported to Lee about sunrise on the 17th. A. P. Hill's division was detained in Harper's Ferry until the morning of the 17th. He marched at 7:30 a.m. with 5 brigades, leaving Thomas's to look after the captured property, to remove which Jackson had requested Lee to send his chief quartermaster and ordnance officer. Thus it happened that when I arrived at Shepherdstown about noon on the 16th with my ordnance train, and rode across the river and reported to Lee, I was ordered to collect all empty wagons and go to Harper's Ferry and take charge of the surrendered ammunition, bringing back to Sharpsburg all suiting our calibers, and sending to Winchester whatever we could not use in the field. The prospect of this addition to our supply was grateful, for the expenditures had been something at Boonesborough, Crampton's Gap, and Harper's Ferry, and the loss of the 45 loads, burned by the cavalry, had been a severe blow at such a distance from our base at Culpeper. I was soon on my way back, and encamped that night with many wagons not far from Harper's Ferry. It had been easily within Lee's power, all day on the 15th, to cross the river into Virginia without loss, and to reunite his scattered divisions and collect his multitude of stragglers behind the Potomac. The more that one studies the situation, the more amazed he must be at the audacity which deliberately sought a pitched battle in the open field, without a yard of earthworks, against a better equipped army of double his force, and with a river close behind him, to be crossed by a single ford, peculiarly bad and exposed, in case he had to retreat. A defeat would certainly involve the utter destruction of his army. At Manassas, at Ox Hill, and even at Boonesborough and Crampton's Gap, he had had recent evidence that there was in the Federal Army, and especially in the Army of the Potomac, no lack of veteran troops, well organized, well led, and capable of strong offense and stubborn defense. Let us analyze the conditions, and balance roughly the pros and the cons. The actual number which McClellan brought upon the field of Sharpsburg during the battle he states at 87,164. Besides these, Couch's and Humphrey's divisions, 14,000 men, were within a day's march and arrived, on the 18th, in time for use either in defeat or victory. Lee's force should have been about 55,000 men, but we have already referred to the enormous amount of straggling caused by poor discipline, lack of shoes, and hard marches on the insufficient diet of green corn and apples. That the effects were not unknown to Lee is shown by the following extracts from his letters to President Davis. On September 13, from Hagerstown, he wrote, "Our great embarrassment is the reduction of our ranks by straggling, which it seems impossible to prevent with our present regimental officers. Our ranks are very much diminished, I fear from 1/3 to 1/2 of our original numbers, though I have reason to hope our casualties in battle will not exceed 5,000 men." After the Battle of Sharpsburg, on September 21, he wrote more fully as follows. "A great many men belonging to the army never entered Maryland at all. Many returned after getting there, while others who crossed the river kept aloof. The stream has not lessened since crossing the Potomac, though the cavalry has been constantly employed in endeavouring to arrest it. Some immediate legislation, in my opinion, is required, and the most summary punishment should be authorized. It ought to be construed into desertion in face of the enemy, and thus brought under the rules and articles of war. To give you an idea of its extent, in some brigades I will mention that on the morning after the Battle of the 17th, General Evans reported to me on the field, where he was holding the front position, that he had but 120 of his brigade present, and that the next brigade to his, that of General Garnett, consisted of but 100 men. General Pendleton reported that the brigades of Generals Lawton and Armistead, left to guard the ford at Shepherdstown, together contained but 600 men. This is a woeful condition of affairs. Lawton's brigade had been the largest in the army, and it had carried into action at Gaines' Mill on June 27th 3,500 men. It has seemed incredible to many writers that the small forces mentioned in many of the official reports as engaged at Sharpsburg could be correctly stated, But I am satisfied from my own observations at the time that the following estimate by Colonel Walter H. Taylor, General Lee's adjutant, is essentially correct. It must be noted also that the Federal equipment was far superior to that of the Confederates. Not only was their artillery more numerous and with a greater proportion of 20-pounder rifles and 12-pounder guns, as against 10-pounder rifles and 6-pounder guns of the Confederates, and with better qualities of projectiles and fuses, but their infantry was almost entirely supplied with rifled muskets, while the Confederate infantry carried about 30% of smooth-bore muskets. Per contra. There is a single item, but it is an important one. Not only did McClellan bring upon the field his 87,176 well-equipped men against Lee's 35,255 ragged and poorly equipped, but he brought himself also. Perhaps the anticipation of that fact encouraged Lee to risk the odds, and if so, the event justified his judgment. McClellan not only fought his battle in detail, engaging not more than 2 of his 6 corps simultaneously, but he held 2 of them out of the battle almost entirely: Porter's 5th Corps with 19,586 men, and Franklin's 6th with 12,300. The total casualties in these 2 corps, 31,186 strong, were but 109 in the 5th Corps and 439 in the 6th, less than were experienced in many single brigades. So when the proper deduction is made from the Federal forces for McClellan's presence, and a fair allowance for the disadvantage of the Federals in having to take the offensive, all that would otherwise seem incredible about the battle disappears, and it is seen to be both natural and reasonable that the game should result in a draw. For the fighting was of about 47,000 Federals attacking 35,000 Confederates under Lee, Jackson, and Longstreet in a fairly good defensive position. Next to the comparative forces of the combatants, the most important feature of the situation was the topography of the battlefield which Lee had chosen. It was a fairly good one for defence, as positions go in a well-settled agricultural country, but it was by no means as strong as it is often said to be. The line was somewhat over 3 miles long, from its left flank on the Potomac to its right at Burnside's Bridge across the Antietam. Its left flank had an excellent position for defence against cavalry, and it was held by Stuart's cavalry and artillery successfully against the Federal cavalry which was opposed to it. Hence, running southeast about a mile, generally behind fences and across open ground, it crossed the Hagerstown Pike and became parallel to it and about a quarter of a mile in front of it. At this point, the Antietam is about a mile away to the eastward, winding its way a little west of south. After holding these courses for about a mile and a half, the turnpike reaches Sharpsburg, the line of battle here being a fourth of a mile in front of the village and a half mile in the rear of the river. Here the pike and the line turn more to the east and unite at Burnside's Bridge about a mile away. This bridge is over 2 miles above the junction of the Antietam with the Potomac. This flank was the weakest part of the line, for the river below was crossable by infantry at several points, and the flank was therefore practically in the air. A strong feature of our centre was that the Antietam cut in half the ground over which the enemy must manoeuvre, and would more or less embarrass any infantry attack upon it. But per contra, there were 2 ugly features. 1. The country is a rolling one, and the hills near the stream are often quite steep, thus giving the enemy fairly close approach under cover. 2. Our whole line except the cavalry on the left was within range of the enemy's rifle guns planted along the high ridges east of the Antietam, beyond the effective range of our guns. Hence, perfectly safe themselves, they practised upon us at leisure all day. Hunt, the Federal Chief of Artillery, describes the location of 10 heavy batteries of the reserve artillery and says, "They overlooked the enemy and swept most of the ground between them and our troops. They were well served, especially the guns of Benjamin's battery. Their field of fire was extensive, and they were usefully employed all day, and so constantly that the supply of ammunition for the 20-pounders ran short." As to how our artillery fared in opposition, we may judge from a remark made to me 2 months later by Colonel S.D. Lee, upon my being transferred to the artillery service. "Pray that you may never see another Sharpsburg. Sharpsburg was artillery hell. D. H. Hill, in his report, says that he had nearly 50 guns available, and writes, "Positions were selected for as many of these guns as could be used, but all the ground in my front was commanded by the long-range artillery of the Yankees on the other side of the Antietam, which concentrated their fire upon every gun that opened and soon disabled it." Whatever the advantages or disadvantages of the field, there was one feature of it which should have been conclusive against giving battle there. That feature was the Potomac River. We were backed up against it within 2 miles, and there was no bridge, and but a single ford accessible, and that a bad one, rocky and deep. On the Maryland side, a mile of hilltops, some of them beyond the Antietam, offered sites for rifled guns to rake the ford and entirely cut off any retreat, should we meet with a reverse. This single feature of the field should have been conclusive against giving battle there. I believe that Lee would never have done so, had he ever before crossed the ford in person. Briefly, the most sanguine hope which Lee could reasonably entertain with his inferior force was to fight a drawn battle and then safely withdraw what was left of his army. Against it he risked its utter destruction, which would have been the speedy end of the Confederacy. Ropes, the best critic and the best informed writer upon the war, comments as follows upon the situation at this time. This decision to stand and fight at Sharpsburg, which General Lee took on the evening of September 14, just after his troops had been driven from the South Mountain passes, is, beyond controversy, one of the boldest and most hazardous decisions in his whole military career. In truth, it is so bold and so hazardous that one is bewildered that he should even have thought seriously of making it. Nearly the whole force which he had on the north bank of the Potomac had been engaged that afternoon in an unsuccessful attempt to hold a defensive position, and it had been badly beaten. Of his 2 principal lieutenants, one, Longstreet, was opposed to this perilous course. Jackson, however, was, as we know, in favour of making a stand at Sharpsburg. From a careful study of all the reports upon both sides, not only of the text, but between the lines, I believe that the course of Lee was largely influenced by the hope, and that of McClellan by the fear, of events whose improbability surpassed that of an earthquake. To McClellan they evidently seemed, however, easily possible. So much so that in explaining why he did not renew the battle on September 18th, he was not ashamed to give frank expression to his fear as follows. At that critical juncture, I should have had a narrow view of the condition of the country had I been willing to hazard another battle with less than an absolute assurance of success. At that moment, Virginia lost, Washington menaced, Maryland invaded, the national cause could afford no risk of defeat. One battle lost, and almost all would have been lost. Lee's army might then have marched as it pleased on Washington, Baltimore, Philadelphia, or New York. If McClellan entertained such fears at the close of the battle, must it not have been these fears which made his coming to the battle so slow and deliberate as to allow Lee even superfluous time to make his escape if he wished? Considering the rare opportunity which chance had given him for brilliant and decisive work, he displayed little ambition to be at it, and his conduct was more suggestive of providing a bridge for a flying enemy. Lee's hopes were by no means so exaggerated as McClellan's fears. He counted upon no hope from Maryland until his own army should have demonstrated its ability to maintain itself within the state. He hardly hoped for more than to detain the enemy upon the northern frontier until the approach of winter should render his advance into Virginia difficult, if not impracticable. But he did entertain hopes of a decisive victory here on a field more remote from a safe place of refuge for the enemy than his victories of the 7 Days and of 2D Manassas had been. The hope would have been reasonable had his army been larger and his armament better, but under all the circumstances and conditions, it was as improbable of realization as the chance of an earthquake would have been. He did, indeed, win a complete victory over all the infantry which the enemy engaged, but their position was more favourable to prevent his making a counterstroke than was his to resist their attack. Their heavy guns across the Antietam gave him protection, just as at Fredericksburg the Federal artillery on the Stafford Heights, afterward in 2 battles, safely covered the Federal infantry on the opposite shore. Briefly, Lee took a great risk for no chance of gain except the killing of some thousands of his enemy with the loss of, perhaps, 2/3 as many of his own men. That was a losing game for the Confederacy. Its supply of men was limited, that of the enemy was not. That was not war. Yet now, who would have it otherwise? History must be history, and could not afford to lose this battle from its records. For the nation is immortal and will forever prize and cherish the record made that day by both sides, as actors in the boldest and the bloodiest battle ever fought upon this continent. Longstreet and D.H. Hill, after their night march from Boonesborough, took line of battle in front of Sharpsburg early on the morning of September 15. During the morning, the news of the surrender of Harper's Ferry was received, and gave a different complexion to the whole situation. Until that time, Lee had contemplated crossing the river at Shepherdstown, and he had directed Jackson to move to that vicinity to cover the crossing. But Jackson replied that he could bring his divisions over to Sharpsburg, upon which he was ordered to do so. On the morning of the 15th, McClellan in person started in pursuit of Lee from Turner's Gap with 4 corps, the 1st, 2d, 5th, and 12th, comprising 33 brigades of infantry. After a march of about 7 miles, he found Lee with the 14 brigades under Longstreet and D.H. Hill in line of battle in front of Sharpsburg about noon. They scarcely numbered 10,000 infantry, and McClellan must have known that all the remainder of Lee's army was concentrated about Harper's Ferry. He could never wish for a fairer chance to crush an adversary, but he did nothing that afternoon or the next morning. During the 16th, he was joined by the 9th Corps, and at 7:30 p.m. he ordered 2 divisions of the 6th Corps from Pleasant Valley under Franklin to join him next day, while the 3D Division under Couch was ordered to occupy Maryland Heights. For what useful purpose it is hard to divine. Meanwhile, his plan of battle had been formed. It was to send the 1st, 3rd, and 12th Corps, over 30,000 men, across the Antietam above the Confederate lines, to turn their left flank, while the 9th Corps under Burnside, about 10,000, should attack their right at Burnside Bridge as soon as things looked favourable above. The 5th and 6th Corps, Porter and Franklin, would be in reserve opposite our centre with 31,339 infantry and artillery, besides a considerable force of cavalry and horse artillery. The plan was not a good one, involving as it did a piecemeal beginning. The 3 corps to attack the Confederate left should have been under one commander and should have moved together. Instead, the 1st Corps, under Hooker, was started about 2 p.m. on the 16th, the 12th Corps, under Mansfield, not until 11:30 p.m. The Sud Corps, under Sumner, was ordered to be ready to march an hour before daylight. It was ready, but received no orders. After daylight, the battle having opened and the firing become heavy, Sumner rode to McClellan's headquarters to ask for orders, and waited an hour or more without being able to see him. Orders to advance finally reached him at 7:30 a.m. The sun had risen at 5:45, and Hooker had become engaged soon after daylight, probably about 5 o'clock. Sumner had some distance to march, and was only able to get into action after 10 a.m. By this time, as we shall see, Hooker and Mansfield had been wrecked, and Sumner's wreck soon followed. When Lee formed his line on the 16th, Jackson's 2 divisions held the left, between the Hagerstown Pike and Stuart's cavalry, which held a road nearer the river. Hood's 2 brigades had their left upon the pike, and on their right, D.H. Hill's division formed a curve by which the line swept around parallel to the pike. Longstreet, with Jones's division and Evans's brigade, extended the line to the Burnside Bridge. Walker's division was in reserve behind the extreme right flank. McLaws's, Anderson's, and A.P. Hill's divisions had not yet arrived. Some artillery duelling across the Antietam took place, but the first infantry affair occurred late in the afternoon, when Hooker's corps came in contact with Hood's pickets. Hooker's orders were to attack. It is hard to believe that McClellan deliberately sent a single corps so far away from prompt support to attack Lee's whole army in position, and had daylight lasted, Hooker would probably have been overwhelmed that afternoon. McClellan had ridden with Hooker in the beginning of his march, and Hooker had called his attention to the hazard of sending him so far upon such a serious errand. It was probably this remonstrance of Hooker's which moved McClellan to send Mansfield at 11:30 p.m. and to order Sumner to be ready to move an hour before daylight. The time of these orders is much more suggestive of a gradually developed plan than of one formulated beforehand, and it resulted in 4 extensive combats instead of in one great battle. The engagement in the afternoon between Hood and Hooker's advance was quite sharp, Hood advancing Law's brigade to the support of his skirmishers and driving back until dark the enemy's advance. In this affair, Colonel Liddell of 11th Miss and Colonel McNeil of the 1st Par, Bucktail Rifles, both distinguished and promising officers, fell mortally wounded. The fighting ceased at dark, and pickets were established on each side, in such close proximity that they could hear each other's voices. About 9, a light rain began to fall and continued most of the night. When all was quiet, Hood's brigades were withdrawn to cook rations, they having been without food, but 1/2 ration of meat, for 3 days. Their positions were filled by Lawton's and Trimble's brigades, of Lawton's division, which were in reserve near Jackson's line, with Hayes's brigade in support. At early dawn the fight was renewed, and Hooker's 3 fine divisions advanced in columns of brigades in line. Doubleday on the right, Ricketts on the left, and Meade in reserve close behind. 10 brigades with 10 batteries. The fighting even before sunrise had become very severe. In his official report, Hooker gives the following. We had not proceeded far before I discovered that a heavy force of the enemy had taken possession of a cornfield. I have since learned about a 30-acre field, in my immediate front. From the sun's rays falling on their bayonets projecting above the corn, I could see that the field was filled with the enemy with arms in their hands, standing apparently at support arms. Instructions were immediately given for the assemblage of all my spare batteries near at hand, of which I think there were 5 or 6, to spring into battery on the right of this field and to open with canister at once. In the time I am writing, every stalk of corn in the northern and greater part of the field was cut as closely as could have been done with a knife, and the slain lay in rows, precisely as they had stood in their ranks a few moments before. It was never my fortune to witness a more bloody, dismal battlefield. Those that escaped fled in the opposite direction from our advance and sought refuge behind the trees, fences, and stone ledges nearly on a line with the Dunker Church, as there was no resisting this torrent of death-dealing missives. This attack fell principally upon Lawton's and Hayes's brigades extending from the Hagerstown Pike through the cornfield to the right. Trimble's brigade, on their right, connected with D.H. Hill's division. Hayes's brigade had also just been brought up in rear of Lawton's as a support. Across the pike, Doubleday's division had, at the same time, made a furious attack upon the old Jackson division under J.R. Jones. This division, though of 4 brigades, was one of the smallest in the army, Jones reporting that it went into action with only 1,600 men. Its position on the extreme left was exposed to the view of, and enfiladed and taken in reverse by, the enemy's rifle batteries across the Antietam at a range of about 3,000 yards. Hooker's troops were well handled. Both his infantry and artillery and the full fighting power of his whole corps was soon brought into play and skillfully applied. The Confederate resistance was desperate, and the slaughter upon both sides great. Lawton and J.R. Jones were both borne off wounded within an hour. Jones was succeeded by Stark of Louisiana, who soon after fell pierced by 3 balls and survived but a few moments. Colas Douglas, commanding Lawton's brigade, was killed, and 5 out of 6 regimental commanders. The brigade lost 554 killed and wounded out of 1150. Hayes's brigade lost 323 out of 550, including all of his staff and every regimental commander. In Trimble's brigade, Colonel Walker, commanding the brigade, was wounded, along with one of his staff, and the brigade lost 3 out of 4 regimental commanders and 228 men out of 700 present. Early's, the remaining brigade of Ewell's division, had been sent about dawn to the extreme left as a support to Stuart's cavalry, which occupied a position where our artillery could annoy the flank of Hooker's attack. When Lawton was wounded, Early and his brigade were sent for. Leaving the 13th VAR, numbering less than 100 men, with Stuart at his request, Early started back toward the position where he had left the other brigades of the division. But soon he came upon Coles, Grigsby and Stafford, with about 300 men, who were the remnant of J.R. Jones's division. He learned that Lawton and Hayes had also been driven back with great losses, and that only a handful were left, who were probably not in condition to go into action again. The 10 brigades of Hooker had carried the whole line held in their front by the 7 brigades which they had struck, with such losses of men and officers as practically to put the Confederate brigades out of action for the day, and to make a great gap in Lee's line from Early's brigade on the left to D.H. Hill's line upon the right. In this gap was Hooker's corps, badly shaken by the desperate resistance which it had overcome, but with the 12th Corps just arriving to its support. Not far in their front were Hood's 2 unfortunate brigades who had not yet gotten their last night's suppers. When the fighting ceased the night before, Hood, moved by the hunger of his men, had gone to Lee and asked for 2 brigades to take his place in the line of battle for the night, that he might have time to cook. Lee had answered that he would gladly send them, but that he had none available. He suggested, however, that Hood should see Jackson. Hood rode a long time in search of Jackson, and at last found him alone, asleep on the ground at the root of a tree. Jackson at once gave the orders which had put Lawton's and Trimble's brigades in the place of Hood and Law, and also sent Hayes in support of Lawton. But he had exacted from Hood a promise that he would come instantly when called to support the line. Hood then rode to find his wagons and bring up the rations, but the darkness caused such delay that it was already dawn, and the sound of battle was heard in front before many of the men had time to do more than to prepare their dough. No meat had been issued for several days, and only reduced rations of flour. Soon afterward, a staff officer of Lawton's dashed up with the message, "General Lawton's compliments, and will you come at once to his support?" To arms was instantly sounded, and the lines formed and marched to the front, leaving the half-cooked dough in camp. Near the Dunker church they passed Lawton, being borne to the rear on a litter, and here Hood found Hayes with about 40 men, whom he had rallied, but all out of ammunition. He suggested to Hayes to withdraw and collect his men and replenish ammunition. He then launched his 2 brigades, about 2,000 men, under Wofford and Law, through the bloody cornfield, already thickly strewn with dead and dying. Hood's brigades had made the successful charge at Gaines' Mill, which broke through Porter's entrenched line, but he wrote in his report that here he witnessed the most terrific clash of arms, by far, that has occurred during the war. Hooker was wounded, and the enemy was driven back so far as to be forced to abandon some of his guns. Meanwhile, Early's brigade on his left, in the long body of woods called the West Woods, on the left of the Hagerstown Pike, was able to hold the enemy at bay and to protect Stuart's flank. When Early left with Stuart but 1 small regiment of infantry, Stuart withdrew from his advanced position to a hill a little nearer our line. Here he had 13 pieces of artillery and was able to greatly annoy the Federal infantry near the Hagerstown Pike. On Hood's right the battle had been held by 3 brigades, which D.H. Hill had had near at hand and in reserve, Colquitt's, Ripley's and Garland's, the last now under McRae. On Hood's left, Lee had sent Walker's 2 brigades and the Gay Brigade of G.T. Anderson of D.R. Jones's division, which he had withdrawn from his right flank opposite the Burnside Bridge. Mansfield's 12th Corps had reinforced Hooker just in time to save the 1st Corps from being routed by the counterstroke, given so heavily by Hood and his reinforcements. Hooker's corps had now lost 2590 men and was practically put out of action. Meade succeeded to the command of the corps when Hooker was wounded, and he withdrew from the field to a commanding ridge about a mile in rear, where he endeavoured to collect the remnants and on which he now established a battery of 30 guns. In his official report, McClellan says that the 1st Corps was for the time much scattered and somewhat demoralized, and that there were but 6,729 men present on the 18th, whereas on the morning of the 22nd there were 13,093 present for duty in the same corps, showing that previous to and during the battle 6,364 men were separated from their commands. The defeat of Hooker's corps may be considered as ending the first affair of the day, but the ending of that and the beginning of the second, with Mansfield's 12th Corps, somewhat overlapped each other in occurrence. Mansfield had but 2 divisions, Williams's with 2 brigades, and Greene's with 3. The fight which now followed can scarcely be told in detail. It was one continuous exchange of heavy musketry and artillery at quarters sometimes as near as 50 yards or less, sometimes in woods and sometimes in the open ground, sometimes receding and again advancing. Action and reaction in such affairs are usually not very unequal, and 6 of the 9 Confederate brigades now conducting it, McCrae, Ripley, Colquitt, Law, Wofford, and Early, had exhausted a part of their strength upon Hooker. After nearly 2 hours of this heavy fighting, with ammunition nearly gone and supplied principally with cartridges obtained from the dead and wounded, with ranks reduced to skeletons, the gap which Hooker had originally opened again yawned even more widely, and Greene's division had entered it and was in possession of the Dunker Church and a portion of the woods near it. But the 12th Corps had now itself lost all of its aggressiveness, and was glad to pause and await reinforcement. Mansfield had been killed early in the action, and his corps now under Williams had sustained a loss of 1,746 men out of 8,000. Williams's division had suffered so severely that it was withdrawn to the rear to rest and replenish ammunition. Here may be said to end in a draw the second affair. The combatants upon both sides were worn out to frazzles, and the firing had ceased entirely. The remnant of Hood's division was also withdrawn to replenish ammunition. The Texas Brigade under Wofford had lost 548 men out of 864 carried into action. The 1st Texas Regiment had lost 45 killed, 141 wounded, and 12 missing from 227. Law's brigade had lost 454. But this truce was of short duration. From the northwest heavy masses of blue, and from the south long lines of grey, were marching rapidly toward the fields, already so thickly strewn with killed and wounded. A third encounter, equally desperate and bloody, was now to take place over the bodies of slain and wounded, friends and foes. At 7:20 a.m. Sumner had, at last, received his needlessly delayed orders to advance. If his 9 brigades of veterans had been put into action along with Mansfield's 5, they would have made decisive work upon Lee's left flank and have opened the road to Porter's corps to attack his centre. Here McClellan threw away another one of his many chances for a decisive victory, though it was by no means his last. The march of Sumner's columns could be seen from commanding points upon the Confederate lines, and movement was also seen in Porter's corps, suggestive of preparation for assault. Several of his battalions crossing the Boonesborough Bridge and coming to the support of his cavalry and horse artillery. Meanwhile, Lee was sending to the front his last reserves, McLaws's and R. H. Anderson's divisions, which had marched from Harper's Ferry at 3 p.m. on the 16th and arrived near Sharpsburg soon after sunrise. These troops had had hard marching in withdrawing from Pleasant Valley and passing through Sharpsburg, and on arrival were allowed a rest of about an hour. By that time it was seen that Sumner's attack was imminent, and they were ordered to the front. R. H. Anderson's 6 brigades, about 3,600 strong, were sent to D. H. Hill's division. But Armistead's brigade was presently withdrawn and added to McLaws's division. McLaws's 4 brigades, about 3,000 strong, were directed to the woods behind the Dunker Church under the guidance of Hood, who was acquainted with the ground.